Music that moves you. It could only be one place. Universal Broadcasting Network. Tune in at ubnradio.com.
Real life isn't always easy. Real life brings tough questions and difficult decisions. That's why there's Compassionate Conversation with Kathryn Tull.
Say what you need to say. Say what you need to say.
Every Wednesday at 11 a.m. Pacific, a show about life and the choices we make. Compassionate Conversation with Kathryn Tull on ubnradio.com.
Hi, this is Kathryn Tull, your host for Compassionate Conversation, coming to you live from Sunset Gower Studios in Hollywood, California. It's another beautiful day in Los Angeles, even though the sun's not shining yet. I want to tell you that the sun is shining right here in this studio. I am going to get straight to it. As you know, I'm a licensed psychotherapist. I deal with very interesting and difficult issues all the time in my practice. That's why it's so important to talk with you every week about bringing more compassion into your life for yourself and into the lives of all whom you touch on a regular basis, because we live in a world where compassion is not emphasized enough. Competition, getting ahead, being better than, those are the things that get talked about all the time. But what we really need to do is bring more compassion for ourselves and everybody else into the world every day, because that is the only way that things can truly get better. And because any day that you turn on the news, what you're going to hear about first and foremost is violence, violence, violence. And as you know, this month I've been talking all month about the topic of domestic violence and interpersonal violence, honoring Domestic Violence Awareness Month, all month of October. And today I am so hugely excited to have in studio with me one of my absolute heroes, the author of the most widely read book on domestic violence, It Could Happen to Anyone. Please help me welcome Alyce LaViolette. It is so amazing to have you in the studio today, Alyce. You and I met this past September at the conference on violence, abuse, and trauma in San Diego, and I started to cry as soon as I met you because you've been my hero for 13 years.
Thank you, Kathryn.
So I want to tell the audience just a little bit about you. Alyce has been working with victims of domestic violence since 1978, working with perpetrators, aggressors, and abusers since 1979. Alyce, you are the founding co-chair of the Association of Batterers Intervention Programs, and you started in 1980 with a task force, which then grew into ABIP, the association. Is that correct?
That's correct.
You are also a licensed psychotherapist. You have been for many, many years. You speak nationally and internationally. You are an expert witness for the courts for nearly 30 years. And I'm leaving something out, and I'm forgetting what that is. And, of course, you are the author of this remarkable book, It Could Happen to Anyone, Why Battered Women Stay. This book so opened my eyes and changed my world, and I taught from this book for many, many years. It was required reading for all of my students. I'm so grateful to you and your co-author for writing this and for educating the world. And so right at the top, Alyce, I thought that it would be helpful for us to start by defining domestic violence, because recently there's been a lot of pushback that demonstrates the extraordinary level of misinterpretation and misinformation that people want to hold on to about what domestic violence is, what interpersonal violence is. So why don't we start by talking about that? Let's define domestic violence for everybody.
Well, when you look at domestic violence, you want to look at a range of behaviors, and you want to look at a context, and you want to look at a pattern of behavior. And there's a range of people who do this, and there are also isolated acts of aggression that can happen in otherwise, really healthy families. So part of what's happened is that we've begun to define any act of aggression as domestic violence without looking at the power differential between the couple, without looking at the pattern, without looking at why it happened and the result of what happened.
Yes.
And when we do that, we wind up saying that there's gender equivalence with domestic violence, that men and women hit each other at about the same level. And in terms of a lot of the research, that's true, but they don't ask why they did it.
That's right.
The result of why it happened.
That's right.
Or the result of what happens. And they don't ask, they don't gender the acts. They don't ask the psychological impact. None of those things are really answered. So when you look at domestic violence, I look at a range of behavior that goes from not just physical abuse, because I think oftentimes what people look at are movies like Sleeping with the Enemy and Burning Bed and
Yes.
J-Lo's Enough.
Yes.
And they picture that, and that's the only thing that is domestic violence.
That's right. And so the kinds of psychological abuse that go on in relationships everywhere on a daily basis have been normalized. And let's talk about that a bit, because I think that that's one of the grossest misconceptions about what interpersonal violence includes. People don't talk about emotional abuse, verbal abuse, how those can add up to a cycle of psychological abuse that is absolutely extraordinarily damaging.
You can actually have, if you look at a range of abuse, and in my continuum, and Michael Johnson has a continuum of aggression and abuse, Amy Holtzworth Monroe and Gregory Stewart, and they look at the worst kind of perpetrator, and the worst kind of perpetrator doesn't have to lay a hand on anyone. That person can isolate the partner, that
Yes.
person can humiliate and embarrass the partner, that person can insidiously control
Yes.
that person without laying a hand on them.
Absolutely.
And if you look at sort of the precursors to the hostage syndrome, one of them is called monopolization of perception. And what it means is that I control the way you see the world because of the power I wield in that relationship,
Right.
and because of the apprehension that begins to develop in you, even if there's no physical violence. Now, certainly most of the worst domestic violence includes physical
Yes.
and psychological. But psychological abuse can change a person's personality, and does.
Yes.
And so when you look at kinds of violence, on the lower end, and by the way, when I say lower end, I don't mean that correlates in any way with the level of fear. You can have
Good,
low-end
yes.
physical aggression, you can have low-end verbal aggression, and still have high fear with people.
And high damage.
And high damage, absolutely. So, there are threats that people make.
Yes.
And at a lower end, they're threats of abandonment. They're
That's
threats
right.
of taking kids. They're threats of taking money. At the higher end, they're not just threats to harm or kill, but they will tell you how they'll do it.
Exactly.
So there's this range of all kinds of abuse.
You know, when I was teaching domestic violence at the graduate level, which I'm just recently recognizing how much I miss doing that, I really loved doing it, I started using the term personal terrorism because people are willing to think about terrorists as being very manipulative and very sneaky and using lots of very covert kinds of techniques to terrorize people. And yet, when you suggest that happens in an intimate relationship, people will poo-poo you and say, oh, no, that's not true. And domestic violence is only when one partner hits another partner. And that's why they want to decontextualize the gender differentials in power and control and how that shows up in relationships. But I know that in my own personal experience and with many couples that I have worked with, it does feel like terrorism when one person is lording control over another, and it's almost as if the more subtle the control is, the more frightening it is.
Well, nuances are oftentimes not looked at all because it's too difficult. People want to make it so black and white. And it's the same thing when you look at people who are victims of domestic violence. If you make the only kind of perpetrator the guy in the movies,
Yes.
then you make the person who stays with that perpetrator look stupid, because why would anybody stay with someone who's one-dimensional and pure evil?
Right.
And so we're labeling both people in that. We're saying, what's wrong with her? And I hear that all the time. And when I went around the state and did training, there was a required 7-hour course in domestic violence for therapists. So many people said, well, what's wrong with her?
Yes, that's always the first question, isn't it? Just like the subtitle of your book, why do battered women stay?
Well, for so many reasons. And I think when you look at the difference in males and females in terms of beliefs about relationships, culturally, you know, how we look at those. But I think one of the first things that happens is when you have an incident, you're confronted with so many things. For one thing, you love and like your partner.
That's right.
And that's huge.
Yeah.
And another thing is that we rationalize as human beings. Somebody said to me, Alyce, what would you rather do? Would you rather go without sex or rationalization? And I had to think about it for a minute. And they said, have you ever gone a week without a good rationalization? And I thought, probably not. But there are values. I mean, there are values that we have about being abused, about verbally the way somebody talks to us, about the way somebody treats us, about laying hands on somebody in a relationship. But those values come into conflict right away with the values of compassion,
yes,
with the values of forgiveness, with the values of keeping family together, with the value of sticking with someone through thick and thin.
Through thick and thin, absolutely so.
So you have a confrontation of values right away. And then if you add to that, maybe somebody's green card is dependent on the other person.
There's very often issues of financial dependency. We are going to take a very quick break, Alyce. We're going to come right back. I'm blah, blah, blah. I'm not talking. I'm so excited to have in the studio with me today Alyce LaViolette, my hero, author of It Could Happen to Anyone. We're going to talk more about domestic violence. And just before we break, Alyce, I want to just re-summarize. So we are not only talking about when people hit each other. We are talking about emotional abuse, verbal abuse, financial abuse, spiritual abuse. Relationship abuse wears so many faces and takes on so many forms, and all of those contribute to really eroding the other partner's ability to withstand this sort of personal terrorism. I'm Kathryn Tull, licensed psychotherapist, your host for Compassionate Conversation. We'll be right back.
Shows that make you laugh. Shows that make you think. Music that moves you. It could only be one place. Universal Broadcasting Network. Tune in at ubnradio.com.
Drivers, celebrate responsibly this fall. Arrive alive, never drink and drive. This message from Diamante Pools and Patio Incorporated of Livingston, New York. Their service and expertise has earned them a fine reputation. Family owned and operated for over 30 years. For all your openings, closings, and supplies, you name it, they do it. Call 518-851-6684. 518-851-6684. That's Mike Dolores and the staff at Diamante Pools and Patio Incorporated of Livingston, New York. People who care.
Real life isn't always easy. Real life brings tough questions and difficult decisions. That's why there's Compassionate Conversation with Kathryn Tull.
Say what you need to say. Say what you need to say.
Every Wednesday at 11 a.m. Pacific, a show about life and the choices we make. Compassionate Conversation with Kathryn Tull on ubnradio.com.
This is Kathryn Tull, licensed psychotherapist, your host for Compassionate Conversation on ubnradio.com, welcoming you back. Today I have in studio Alyce LaViolette, one of the world's preeminent experts on domestic violence and interpersonal violence, author of It Could Happen to Anyone. Alyce was not too long ago shredded in the media and on social media around the world for her participation in a world sensationalized domestic violence trial. And Alyce, I don't want us to spend a lot of time on that trial. I think that it's been given way too much publicity and way too much press. It is one of hundreds of thousands of those kinds of stories. And I just wanted to say to you that when I was reviewing information last night, preparing for today's show, and I reread several articles on the Huffington Post, and one of their most popular writers even admitted in her article that she had joined a lynch mob. People were just out to get you. People who don't understand the actual dynamics of interpersonal violence in relationships. They don't want to look at the entire picture. One of the comments that you made in one of your testimony statements was that you look at the bigger picture. The people that were shredding you in the news and on social media, as far as I'm concerned, and I'm a clinician, and I have studied and researched this field for nearly 15 years now, those people are misinformed, they are misguided, and they are, whether intentionally or unintentionally, only looking at a particular perspective of the issue that allows them to feel the way they want to feel about that particular case. So I want to say to all of my audience, and you don't have to agree with me, but this is what I believe. Alyce LaViolette is one of the most informed people that there is on the planet today as far as the dynamics, the impact, and the effects of interpersonal violence. And so all of the reports that came out against her, trying to discredit her, trying to tear apart her testimony and the information that she was trying to impart, are people who have purposefully misinterpreted, misunderstood, and misrepresented accurate information that exists. So if you would like to know more accurate information about domestic violence, please look at Alyce's website, which we'll give you the information of before we sign off on the show. You can go to my website, KathrynTull.com. I have links and resources. Alyce will have to get the link to your website up on my website. It's so vital that people actually understand with accuracy what the dynamics of interpersonal violence are and what kinds of impacts those have, not only on the direct victim, but on the collateral victims, on the children, on the families, on the communities in which these kinds of relationships are tolerated. So there.
Wow. I couldn't have paid somebody to be a better advocate for me. That, yeah, you know, it was interesting because I think you had a perfect storm when you were talking about compassion. In that particular trial, compassion actually became a dirty word.
Yes.
And the expert, their expert on the prosecution said, basically, I have no compassion for the people I work with. That was somehow, it was, to me, interesting. That somebody would want to talk from that place. It was almost like, if you're compassionate, you can't be objective.
Right.
And there was a lot of talk about me being, seduced by Jodi. And frankly, Jodi is not that seductive as a person. She's pretty straightforward. And what Jodi did was terrible.
Yes.
But Jodi isn't terrible. And I think the media, you had Nancy Grace, you had Jane Velez Mitchell, and you had Dr. Drew, who's very insidious because he sounds sane. And the three of them fueled hatred in that courtroom. And then you had an out-of-control courtroom.
Yes.
You had a prosecutor who the media never described as a bully, but I had hundreds of calls, cards, letters, faxes that people sent to me saying, he is a bully.
Absolutely.
I had a man in Canada who said, when I watched him with you, it sent me back years to when I used to verbally abuse my wife.
Oh, my goodness.
And he doesn't anymore. I spoke to both of them. By the way, I called or wrote at least to everybody I knew how to get hold of. Mm-hmm. I called and wrote every single person back because there were so many kind people, actually far more people of compassion, and people, battered women who said, you are our voice, you have to keep going, that kept me going on that stand. And an expert witness should never be on the stand for 3 weeks, and I was.
That's just outrageous. And I fully agree that he was a bully. And I had the experience of being bullied by an attorney in divorce court. And I was so freshly out of my own domestic violence marriage that I crumbled. I mean, I absolutely crumbled. I couldn't have a voice, because to be re-bullied in the family court system was beyond my comprehension. And that's a whole other conversation about the complete lack of compassion in the family court system. But let's get back to domestic violence, because one of the questions I wanted to ask you is why? Okay, so in your book, it could happen to anyone. And you and I had a little bit of a conversation when we were down in San Diego, because I have some theoretical perspectives, because my mission is to have more compassion and to bring more compassion into all relationships that I work with personally as a psychotherapist and into the world. I am really trying to look at everything from the lens of having more compassion around every issue. And believe me, that can be a challenge, particularly around the issue of interpersonal violence, because I was battered for nearly 20 years, and my children were battered, and our lives are still, to this day, I see the effects of that in all of us. But why is anyone susceptible to interpersonal violence?
Because most violence in interpersonal relationships happens over time. It's a gradual, there's a saying that you can throw a frog in a pot of boiling water and the frog will jump. But if you put a frog in a pot of water and slow flame,
he'll stay there until he boils to death. That's absolutely right.
But the other part for me is, first of all, the energy of new love is bigger than the energy of fear.
Yes.
And when you're looking at people who perpetrate violence in intimate partner relationships, most of them are more fear-based, and their rage is kind of a cover-up. So it takes a while for that energy to sort of come down, the energy of new love.
Right.
So it takes a while before you start seeing the symptoms of that fear that come up for people. And I often say most of us could live with a serial killer for about a year, and if we were in love, we wouldn't notice, because the killer would be on their best behavior and that energy would be so high. And the other thing is, people are not going to tell you, hey, I occasionally abuse people. That's not going to be a problem in our relationship, is it? I mean, they don't tell you that.
No, they don't. And because they don't view it that way. Because I know that the statistics indicate that not all batterers intervention or aggressors intervention programs, I think you were telling me that the PC word now is
people who use violence or people who use aggression.
Right. So we're not even using the term batterer much anymore. But the statistics have not been really favorable in terms of people's behavior changing for the long term. And I want to say kudos to all those who do stick with the work and change, because one of the things that I do recognize about people who use violence in relationships to any degree is that these are very wounded people.
Yes.
To have enough internalized rage that you are willing and able to consistently damage the person that you love and actually want in your life. Because most interpersonal violence happens in the context of a relationship where both people are having needs met by the other person. And I see that there are so many layers of wounding and unmet needs in the perpetrators as well as in the victims, which makes it that much more complicated and that much more complex a situation. But yesterday you and I were talking about the fact that so many people think that, and we'll talk about women because the statistics allow us to talk more about women. There are more records about that. Why people think that healthy women don't get into an abusive relationship. And yet you and I both now, and all the other clinicians who treat this, know that healthy women do find themselves in abusive relationships. How does that happen?
Well, it happens because of the subtlety of what happens. It happens, age can be a factor. It happens because if you come from a healthy family, you're really not prepared for an abuser. You're not prepared at all. So you could come from a healthy family and you could have your partner say to you something like, wow, that dress really makes you look, it's not great. It's not, wow, you got hired today? They must be hiring anybody. And you could confront them and you could say, hey, that hurt my feelings,
right.
Whatever that is. And they might say to you, you took that wrong. Because that's part of it, the shift in perception. You took that wrong. That's not what I meant. Here's what I meant. And when that happens, if you're from a healthy family where people tell the truth, your presumption is that somebody's telling you the truth. And what happens is your perception begins to change.
Right.
So that happens very early on in the relationship. Isolation happens early on in a relationship because if you have somebody hurt you, and you love that person and you like that person, you're not going to tell your family.
Right.
You're not going to tell your friends. You want people to hang around with. You want people to respect and like your partner.
That's right.
And you don't want anybody to think you have lousy taste.
Right.
So you don't tell. You don't talk about it at first.
Right.
And the more into it you are, the more investment you have.
That's right.
And the belief that you can, because women, and I don't know, when I talk to men in general, they don't believe it that much, but women are certainly spoon-fed that if you love somebody enough, you can change them.
Absolutely, yes.
So when I work with battered women in private practice, one of the things I try to do is refocus them on something that will actually be positive, because if you spend all your time trying to get that person to change, you're defeated consistently.
Yes.
And so I try to refocus people on problems they can actually solve, so that they can begin to get their power back.
Yes.
So they can begin to see themselves as more effective. When you continually try to change somebody who doesn't want to change, I think it's very difficult when and you're talking about compassion, which I think is incredibly important. If you are a recovering addict or alcoholic, if you're in a 12-step program, there's a lot of compassion for that.
Yes, a lot. And a lot in the world. People are very supportive of those who are taking on their own recovery work.
And that's terrific. And I remember speaking for a Girl Scout conference, and at the end of the conference, before we started speaking, it was a community panel. Somebody said, hey, when I leave, I have to get out of here and get to my AA meeting. And somebody said, oh, you're in AA? What? That's terrific. I'm in ACA, and I'm in Al-Anon. And the other woman said, well, I'm in OA, and I go to ISA. Where do you go to, Alyce? And I said, Weight Watchers. And I just wanted to be an A, because I thought, this is terrific. I mean, it's very well accepted. And
Right.
There's an acceptance that recovery is a long-term process.
Right.
When you're dealing with people who are traumatized and have crossed another bottom line, we have to have a similar encouragement for them to get help, because they are so judged. And, I mean, the behavior is horrible. So for a lot of people, there's bad behavior. We need to deal with the bad behavior. But if we want people to change, they have to have some support to go in and say, I hurt the people I love. And to this point, I have not had, I can't think of anybody I've had who's come into my program just because they think personal growth is far out and they can't wait to do it.
Right.
They come in usually because their partner has left or threatened to leave, and they really believe that's going to happen, or God speaks to them through the SWAT team and they have a religious experience.
You're talking about the perpetrators themselves who come into your programs to work with you.
Right. So we need to start looking, and a lot of the research, Kathryn, that's been done has been done on short-term programs. I would tell you what gives me hope. California has a minimum. It's one of 2 states in the country that requires a minimum of a year. A year is nothing.
But at least it's better. I think it used to be like a 12-week, and then it graduated to a 26-week, and then over time it became a 52-week. At least that's what was happening when my perpetrator had to be in a program.
Well, there wasn't any law about how long it had to be. When we started our program, I worked at a battered women's shelter for 6 years. So when I started my program, I was working at the shelter, and I went to the women to ask them what I needed to know. Because we forget to ask the people who are impacted the most.
That's right.
How they are affected and what we can do that would make a difference.
Boy, oh boy, I was talking about that a lot 13 years ago. We need to take another quick break. This is Kathryn Tull, licensed psychotherapist, your host for Compassionate Conversation, in studio today with Alyce LaViolette. Please join us. We're going to come right back. We're going to talk more about why it is that interpersonal violence can happen in so many relationships and how we can help ourselves become more empowered in order to not let that into our relationships. Stay tuned. Come right back.
In the future, talk radio will actually educate, inspire, and make you think. The future is now. Topics and music that affect your life from Universal Broadcasting Network. Tune in at ubnradio.com.
Hi, this is Kathryn Tull, licensed psychotherapist. Life can be complex, and your thoughts about it matter. If you've ever felt stuck and wanted answers, I'm available to help. Through my private practice in Los Angeles, by Skype and by phone, and through my book, The Next Bold Step, help is available. The Next Bold Step, learning to love and value yourself and know that you matter, is your roadmap to deeper self-understanding and moving ahead. Contact me at kathryntull.com. Better tomorrows are waiting.
Real life isn't always easy. Real life brings tough questions and difficult decisions. That's why there's Compassionate Conversation with Kathryn Tull.
Say what you need to say. Say what you need to say.
Every Wednesday at 11 a.m. Pacific, a show about life and the choices we make. Compassionate Conversation with Kathryn Tull on ubnradio.com.
Hi, this is Kathryn Tull, licensed psychotherapist, coming back to you this morning, Compassionate Conversation on ubnradio.com. And I have in studio with me today Alyce LaViolette, preeminent expert on interpersonal violence, author of It Could Happen to Anyone. And we are having a very important conversation this morning, Alyce, about why is anyone susceptible to interpersonal violence? And there's a specific point that I would love for you to talk with us about. And that is that most people tend to think that women, and again, I'll stay with women because there's more research about this, that women who are attracted to or stay in abusive relationships are women with psychological problems. So let's talk about that a bit. Do you agree with that kind of premise?
I believe that there are women in domestically abusive relationships that have psychological problems and women that don't. Why I said it could happen to anyone is because that's been my experience.
Right.
It was my experience even at the shelter, and in the shelter we screened out for resources, but I met women who had come from healthy families. When I went into private practice, I met women who came from healthy families.
Yes.
And it's, part of it, there's old research by O'Leary and Rosenbaum that says the common factor in domestic violence is being a woman. Now, we know that there are men who are battered.
Yes.
And we know that there are men who are abused. But overwhelmingly, when you get to the far end, the end with more injuries, more emergency room, more stalking, all
Yes.
that sort of thing,
Yes.
more homicide, you're talking about male and female violence, unless you're dealing with gay lesbian relationships, and there's not a lot of research there at all. But when you're talking about the belief system that women grow up with, I mean, women still grow up believing that if the relationship fails, they have failed.
That's right.
And if you look at some of the television shows that are on now that are modeling appropriate behavior for women, I mean, I look at The Bachelorette, which is, makes me gag, but I'm older, so there you go. But these shows that, even the detective shows where the women have to be very attractive, a lot of the women are wearing
stiletto heels running down the street.
Yeah.
Yes.
It's like, this is not real life.
Right.
It's like not every woman is airbrushed. And I think that women still believe this, and we get so much that is imparted to little girls. Jean Kilbourne, who did a documentary called Killing Us Softly, which was about how we portray women in the media. Well, it's very good. And Jean co-authored a book called it was about the sexualization of children.
Yes.
And it was about boys too, but girls, because they are sexualized so young.
Yes.
And we're seeing more and more of that. So we're in a way, I think, what we do is encourage people to stay.
And we encourage people to allow themselves to be treated as sexual objects, both male and female. And I'm really glad that you brought that up. That was just something that I was kind of chatting online about this week as well, is that the sexualization, and I see more of it about women, the sexualization of women and the power dominance of women in a sexual and personal context in advertising is phenomenal. Women with very little clothing being used to sell anything from gasoline to stocks, and men dominating women in highly sexualized positions, used to sell jeans, used to sell perfume, used to sell flowers, used to sell cars, for heaven's sakes. So this deep embedded integration into women's mentality that their role in the world is to be sexually and personally dominated by men contributes largely to why a woman who comes from a healthy background may find herself in a relationship where she is being dominated and controlled by a man, and she may not even recognize it because subconsciously there's been so much cultural programming to her to believe that that's what her role is supposed to be.
Well, it's interesting because we think we've come a long way, and we have in many ways. However, like racism, people say, well, there's not racism now, we have a black president. And I thought, talk to black people, talk to people of color, Latino people, talk to Asian people, talk to LGBT people. There's lots of oppression there. We are much less likely to talk about the oppression of females.
Yes.
But if you look even at the election back in 2008, the way Hillary Clinton was described, the way she was, whether you were for Hillary Clinton or not for Hillary Clinton, there was a backlash in New Hampshire because of the way the press dealt with Hillary Clinton. Mm-hmm. I thought that some of the backlash in the Arias trial, I was looking at the fact that we've got 3 young women, Amanda Knox, Casey Anthony, and Jodi Arias, all who are accused of doing monstrous things. We know Jodi did that, but they're described as sluts, whores, and monsters who control men who apparently can't think, which I think is degrading to men as well.
Of course.
And I wonder why our media is so focused on 3 20-something-year-old girls who are young women who are attractive, and when there is so much going on, and they describe them as monsters. And I think the guy in Cleveland who has a pattern of abusive behavior is a monster.
Right.
What they are alleged to have done, and what Jodi did, was monstrous. But why she did it, and Jodi is not a monster. And I don't think she would get out of jail and hurt somebody else. She wouldn't stalk somebody. She wouldn't go out to commit crime. It's not to say she doesn't need help. She does. But she is not a monster. And I think the media has incredible power with that.
Yes, they do. The media has incredible power in our culture and in our world, and now with social media and the viral capacity of the internet, other people's opinions have become even more overwhelmingly powerful, I think. And I think that does play into how people stay in relationships that on some intuitive level, I think most of us who have been in or still are in an abusive relationship know on some intuitive level that this relationship is not good for me. And yet there are so many, you talked earlier about rationalizations, there are so many ways to rationalize staying in a relationship, and in many cases somebody really is completely dependent upon the other person, and they stay because they don't know how to break free and they don't know how to take care of themselves if they do, and it becomes so very, very complicated.
Well, you know, it's interesting because certainly in the shelter I met women who financially were much more dependent. When I went into private practice, I met women who were very successful and looked powerful in the world, but were emotionally, you know, because you don't stop loving and liking somebody just because they hit you or say something that you don't like.
Right.
And the other thing is that we'll do almost anything to make our relationships work.
Yes.
We'll keep trying to make those relationships work. The traits that make somebody a good human being, like compassion, like forgiveness, like empathy, those traits don't change because you're in a bad relationship.
Right.
So you still have that part that makes you a decent human being, and you don't just turn that over. So in a way, one of the things I've tried to do is redefine compassion. So for instance, when women have children, I ask them, is it compassionate if your children are acting out all over the place? Would it be compassionate not to provide discipline for them? And they say, absolutely not.
Right.
And I said, the same is true for your adult partner. If they don't get consequences of some sort, they don't get to learn to do something differently, or they don't get to ask for help and that sort of thing. And one of the other things, Kathryn, that I think is so important, because I know you have children as well.
Yes.
When you go to family court, California is a shared custody state,
yes,
basically. That's the predisposition of the court. Unless you have evidence, and unless you have compelling evidence,
yes,
and lots of it, that this person is abusive, you will get shared custody. And if you have children, there's a lot of fear about what happens with those kids when they're not with you. And that's a really big issue.
It is such a big issue, and we're actually not going to go there today because I will get all worked up and I won't have enough time, and we're down to the last few minutes of the show as it is, and I would love for you to come back on the show and we can talk more about that. Next week I'm actually having a family law attorney who specializes in domestic violence and child abuse cases come onto the show, and we are going to be talking more about that, because that in and of itself is such a huge reason why women do stay in abusive relationships, is because of a lot of misguided notion about, well, my children need their father, even if he's not always the man I wish he would be. And what kind of a mother would I be if I took my children away from their father? And so that contributes, those kinds of notions, in addition to, well, I made a commitment, so I'm in it for life. And if I really loved him enough, then I wouldn't let this bother me, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So there really are thousands of ways that we can tell our minds we need to stay, it's the right thing to stay, I have to stay. And we do that as a form of survival. And one of the things that I've said to a few of my clients who are struggling with the choice about whether to stay in an abusive relationship or not, I have always said to them, look, I also want you to understand that I appreciate what strength it takes to choose to stay in a situation where you recognize you're being hurt. If you decide with all of your best choosing capacity that what you need to do right now is stay at your own risk, at your children's risk, I recognize that it takes an amazing kind of strength to choose to stay in a situation where you know you're being hurt. I know that it took a certain kind of strength on my part to shut down my inner voice and to shut out. There were voices in the community that were beginning to be concerned for me because the perpetrator's behavior was becoming more apparent to other people, and I think that that can happen in relationships where people do begin to express concern. And of course, I denied all of it, and that is very common behavior, is that we deny what's going on because we're embarrassed and ashamed, and we don't want people to think badly of us or our partner. But I've completely lost my train of thought.
Well, on following up on your train of thought that you lost, because I think I know where you're going, but I think it's really important that there is no collection of evidence. So, and I think you were talking about supporting women wherever they are.
Yes.
And the importance of doing that and not letting them get more isolated, which I think is incredibly important, because the worst kinds of domestic violence are usually associated with the worst kinds of isolation.
Yes.
But it's really, for me, and I think about this in the Arias case, the evidence I had was almost all psychological evidence and verbal abuse and put downs and power differential.
And that's why it was so discredited and so jumped on.
But what was really important was there were 4 incidents of physical abuse that Jodi described. And she was not someone who jumped out there and said, she said no, she really fought the whole notion of this. She was not somebody, it was one of the things that I thought, this is so typical. She didn't make reports, and that's one of the things the prosecutor kept saying, and I said, it is so common.
That's right.
And I said, but when I look at the rants, the verbal rants, had she been in the room, it is not a stretch to believe he would have laid hands on her.
Right.
So there were 4 incidents described. One of the things that's true for most women in abusive relationships is they don't keep any records.
That's right.
So when they go to family court,
they've got no backup.
Yeah, and it makes it, I'm not faulting a judge for that. I mean, what's a judge, he or she, going to do when they don't have? So what I suggest to people is just, if you can talk to anyone, if you can tell now if there's an injury, and you tell a doctor, doctors are mandatory reporters. Therapists are mandatory reporters, but not of adult physical abuse. It's only if children are involved.
That's right.
So, but doctors are mandatory reporters. So you've got this, thing that keeps people from using discretion, because we're trying to keep people who use the worst discretion from being awful. But
right.
we never do stop them, but we tie the hands of some other people.
We do, and there continues to be a huge factor of victim blaming because of all the cultural distortion, because of the cultural portrayal of women for so long, not only in westernized society, but in most societies in the world, and the level of layers that this information has to go through in order to make a difference to somebody, to change their perspective on how to view interpersonal violence and what kind of an approach they can personally take in their lives. It is so very complicated, but it's what I want us to make sure to touch on before we wrap up, and we're down to the last 2 minutes of the show, believe it or not, is that it can happen to anyone. Interpersonal violence does not only happen to people with psychological problems, it can happen to anyone, and that it is very important for us to look at the behavior of the perpetrator, not to focus on, well, why did the victim stay? What's wrong with the victim? Why aren't we asking, what's wrong with the perpetrator? Why is the perpetrator acting out against anybody in the first place? And what kind of help do they need? And so I think that the questions that have been historically asked in these kinds of cases are backwards. And I'm not talking about the questions we as clinicians ask, the questions that the world at large asks. And they do that in order to be able to protect themselves from the real information and hold on to their own denial paradigm. They don't want to admit just how badly people can behave in relationship. I'm Kathryn Tull. I'm with Alyce LaViolette on Compassionate Conversation. Alyce, please tell the listeners how they can find out more about you and the work that you're doing.
I have a website, AlyceLaViolette.com. It's the only website I know with no email address because I like people to call me. There's a phone number on it. There's an address on it. That's how people have traditionally gotten in touch with me, and I'm good at returning calls. I actually want to go home and have a life, so I don't have an email address on it.
Oh, good for you.
But there are resources on there. There are some links on there. There's some under publications. There's some handouts that might be useful to people.
Good.
And there's also a list of speaking engagements, and there are 4 speaking engagements that people can click on if they want to hear things.
Great. This interview is going to be posted on my YouTube channel, so you'll be able to access it again. Alyce, I hope that you will come back up so we can have more conversation, because there's so much for us to share and talk about. I'm Kathryn Tull, host of Compassionate Conversation. I'm a licensed psychotherapist. My website is kathryntull.com. My private practice is in West Los Angeles, and I work by Skype and by phone. Please call me. I would love to be of service to you and to your relationships. I'm so glad that you joined us this week. Join us again next week on Compassionate Conversation on ubnradio.com. Many blessings.
Real life isn't always easy. Real life brings tough questions and difficult decisions. That's why there's Compassionate Conversation with Kathryn Tull.
Say what you need to say. Say what you need to say.
Every Wednesday at 11 a.m. Pacific, a show about life and the choices we make. Compassionate Conversation with Kathryn Tull on ubnradio.com.